Hi, this is Jonathan Armstrong from Caudry, the compliance lawyers. Pleased to say that Eric Sinrod is joining us live from his home in California. And Eric, it's that exciting time, really, when we're having a look at some our listeners' questions. So this is a question that actually we've probably had about 4 or 5 years ago. And I think we looked in brief at it then, but I think it's become much more topical since. So thanks very much to Heather Anson, who emailed us and said, should we have a discussion about ethics and technology? And just because technology can do something, does that mean to say it should? And I'm also struck by some work. I've actually spoken at an event recently with Rob Price at Alchemy, who's doing some really interesting work around corporate digital responsibility. And there's a whole movement there, I think, looking at these type of questions. Is there a responsibility on people using technology to use that responsibly and ethically? And I think from a GDPR point of view, if you were to start from there, then I think probably there is. Whenever we're looking at these things, we always encourage people to look at the 6 principles of data protection that are enshrined in GDPR. And Principle 1 obviously says that we must process data lawfully, fairly, and transparently. And there's quite a lot of cases, as we've talked about before, about this transparency obligation and about treating people fairly. You have to do with their data what they might expect. And some regulators have taken this a bit further. German data protection regulators, for example, you'll recall that in Germany, it's a sort of a state-by-state system rather than a federal system for data protection. They met in the famous Hambach Castle, the Hambacher Schloss, as it's known in German, and that's a castle with a lot of history. And they had an AI summit back in 2019 where the data protection regulators across Germany agreed 7 principles for AI. And they were things like AI has to be transparent and fair, like we've said already. It has to avoid discrimination. It has to observe principles of data minimization, which are also in these 6 principles. So what's the minimum data set I can use to get it all to work? And said that effectively AI shouldn't be used to discriminate. So those 7 principles are worth a look, and we'll include a link to that declaration in the notes at the bottom of the screen for people. And I guess the other thing to say is that I think, as we've said on an earlier podcast, there's so many people are saying the law should regulate AI, and I think they forget the fact that in some respects, it already does. So we already have discrimination laws, for example. We have GDPR cases. We had one just last week from Spain, for example, on questionnaires that people would fill in when applying for a job, which asks them information and then presents what the AI says is the best qualified candidate to the hiring people. So we've already had regulators getting involved. I've done a very clumsy, non-scientific piece of work today, and that tells me that about 1.9 billion euros worth of GDPR fines mention AI somewhere in the regulatory outcome. Now, I'm not going to bet my lunch that that number's accurate, but there have certainly been some really big AI-related fines. Clearview AI, for example, has been fined in Greece, in France, in the UK, investigations in Germany, down in Australia outside the GDPR zone. And we've also had the cases that we've talked about before in Italy over food delivery and the way in which AI was used to prioritize different riders or drivers for different deliveries based on all sorts of preferences. So I think there is already an ethical element. creeping into AI particularly, and in the use of technology. And sometimes that's voluntary because the promoters think it's the right thing to do. And sometimes it's mandatory because regulators have intervened and forced them to be more accountable or more fair or more transparent in the way in which they're using AI. But I know, Eric, that you've got, as a good law professor, almost like a case study on ChatGPT, which is obviously one of the poster childs for AI at the moment. And you've got some thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, thank you for the initial remarks, Jonathan. Those were very interesting. And I was listening to your pronunciation. Sprechen Sie Deutsch?
Nein, Vision, mein Deutsch ist sehr schlecht.
I don't either. But yeah, I'm Eric Sinrod with Dwayne Morris in San Francisco. Yeah, ChatGPT, Jonathan, is really taking the world by storm in just the last couple months. It's a chatbot that was first launched by a company out here in the Bay Area. When I say Bay Area, I mean San Francisco Bay Area, by a company called OpenAI in just late 2022. And this is just the beginning of February 2023. So the core function of a chatbot is to mimic a human conversationalist. But ChatGPT can do so much when prompted, so much more, perhaps, like create code, write stories, student essays, answer test questions, compose music, write poetry and song lyrics, play games, and the list goes on and on. Indeed, just yesterday, Jonathan, I was having a conversation in Spanish with ChatGPT. I asked the question, ¿Qué debo hacer hoy? Which means, what should I do today? And I got responses back in Spanish in terms of how I could go to the park or a museum or read a book or cook a meal. You get the idea. But while at times the results from ChatGPT so far are seemingly impressive, there are some problems, including many plausible appearing results that are actually incorrect. So Jonathan, this train is already swiftly moving out of the station, the ChatGPT, for example. And coupled with that, we're already in this post-truth world with social media out of control, different supposed news silos with unreliable sources, and query whether something like ChatGPT will exponentially this progression even further and perhaps create waves of propaganda that incorrectly appear on the surface to be reliable, and that could have some influence. Obviously, opportunities for cheating abound. And now, for example, academic institutions, which is near and dear to my heart because I teach at several universities, are grappling with this issue. How will we know for sure who creates certain works? And it's already difficult enough already. And I read a report that some Stanford students, and Stanford, of course, is an elite university, recently were found out to have used ChatGPT for portions of certain papers. And this problem can show up in the workplace too. And then what about copyright? This is something I've been thinking about, which protects the original expression of an idea. If ChatGPT is prompted to create, let's just say, an artistic work, whether musical or literary, who holds the copyright? The prompter? The chatbot creators? Interesting question. Now, OpenAI, the company that has ChatGPT, does try to put in place some guardrails in an effort to prevent ChatGPT to be used for things like hate and discrimination. But how perfect can that be, at least at this point? So a message here is the overall room for mischief is great. This insanely powerful AI is interfacing with the deep ocean of the internet to create rather than just only retrieve information. So Jonathan, when technology like this is unleashed with such broad social implications, should there be some sort of public or political or both vetting in advance instead of the law trying to catch up after the fact? You were sort of talking about the law creeping in, but as we know, technology explodes out of the box at warp speed, and the law is kind of glacial in trying to follow. Oftentimes, the lawmakers don't even understand the technology for a long time. And when AI like this is unleashed, once it's out in the wild, it becomes more and more difficult to control. So, interestingly, when ChatGPT itself was asked, what are some of the biggest risks of AI becoming more common in society? AI itself listed some of the things you mentioned: loss of jobs, bias and discrimination, security and privacy, loss of human autonomy. So, my friend, throwing it back to you, the genius known as Jonathan Armstrong, where do we go from here with this?
Well, I think you've made a lot of really good points, and I think it is problematical. I've been following a number of debates where people have said that ChatGPT plain lies. So there's some examples around the cutoff date for its gathering of data and how it says it can't answer questions after a certain date, but then miraculously can answer questions about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, which are after the cutoff date, and seemingly lies about how it had ingested that data. Obviously, there's all sorts of allegations about human intervention and whether it's truly AI and whether there are a team of researchers behind the scenes augmenting some of the answers. I know that there's been a debate today over alleged political bias. Apparently, ChatGPT refuses to devise a poem about Donald Trump because it says he's a divisive figure, but will merrily create a poem about Joe Biden in somewhat complimentary terms. So all of these things, I think, all go to the heart of Heather's question in a way. Where is the ethical oversight? Who is doing the right things? And I have had a couple of projects where we've been asked by clients to take an outside-in approach to say, you're not part of the project team, you're looking at it from the outside in. What are the type of things that might be roadblocks for us? What are the ethical considerations we should have? And I know that, as I say, that Rob Price's initiative is trying to embed some of those thoughts in codes, etc. So that might be part of the answer. But I think the law is still part of the answer as well, even the existing law, fallible though it is. We've seen with Clearview AI, for example, that it is not okay to use so-called open source data and harvest it and use it for other effects. And many chatbots are doing that. They're collating data from different parts of the internet and regarding that as a free-for-all, and it isn't. And we've had issues, where in the midst of time, in 1996, there was a case in the UK courts on scraping data from websites called the Shetland Times case and assimilating it into content which a new market entrant effectively passed out as theirs. And there's all that debate around so-called deep linking and scraping, etc. And we forget that many sites, LinkedIn, for example, have terms and conditions that prohibit effectively the scraping of data from their sites and its merging into other offerings and its sale. Why? Because LinkedIn say that that's their revenue. They made whatever they made, a considerable amount of money last year in using that data themselves. And using any form of AI, chatbot, whatever that is, undermines their business model. It could be unlawful because it could be in breach of the terms and conditions. And then that could even be a criminal offense under computer misuse legislation in the UK, for example, if you're using your lawful access to a site for an unlawful purpose. So I think there are considerable legal hurdles as well as the ethical ones. It obviously requires really careful thought. And I think also we need to make sure that offerings like this, if they're being seen as global, are global. And somewhat trivially, my test whenever I'm asked to look at some sort of intelligent platform, I don't know why I do this, is to ask them questions about 1980s comedy duos. So that's always my acid test. So the equivalent of I say Laverne, you say Shirley, or whatever that might be. And I can tell you, ChatGPT is very, very poor on 1980s comedy duos. But perhaps more seriously, I don't think they've registered with the UK Information Commissioner either. So you can't have a sort of global application that doesn't respect the laws. So aside ethical considerations, I think there are legal ones as well. And of course, how is it going to deal with requests that relate to how decisions are made, which you're entitled to ask under GDPR, things like the right to object to automated processing, all of this sort of stuff. There are problematical issues. And again, there's the well-rehearsed issues around enforcing bias, as we've touched on before. So, there are all sorts of issues around jury selection, for example. Does a AI application just replicate prejudices that already exist in humans? The same with employment. And potentially, as I've said, this exposure today over maybe some inherent political bias that reflects the people training the dragon rather than the thoughts of the dragon itself. So I think it's obviously an interesting topic to discuss, and thanks very much to Heather for the suggestion. I suspect though there are more questions than answers, are there?
So many more questions. In fact, it didn't occur to me, but it would have been fascinating to ask the chatbot, ask ChatGPT, how would you draft laws to regulate artificial intelligence, and to see what it would come up with? Because the question was asked, what are some of the problems from occurring because of AI, but how would you solve it, ChatGPT?
Yeah. Well, that can be everybody's homework. Let's all ask let's ask the bot the same question. Yeah, but don't rely on it as a conclusive answer.
Or as Jonathan Armstrong says, don't bet your lunch on it yet.
That's right.
It's still in its infancy. All right. Well, this was a fascinating topic.
Yeah, and thanks very much again to Heather for suggesting it. If anyone else has got any other suggestions for topics that we should pick up and maybe answer indecisively, or at least throw some thoughts around, then we're really happy to do so. So why don't you give people your contact details, Eric?
Yes, my name is Eric Sinrod. I'm at Duane Morris in the San Francisco office. We're an international law firm. My email address is ejsinrod, EJSINROD, at DuaneMorris.com, DUANE Morris.com. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, and you. And I'm Jonathan Armstrong. So jonathan.armstrong@caudrycompliance.com. We'll put those email addresses at the in the text at the bottom of the YouTube page if you're watching us on YouTube. If you're listening to us as a podcast, then I'm sure you'll find our details somehow. You could even ask ChatGPT.
Very good.
And with that, I guess time to sign off. And thanks again for the suggestion. Thanks for listening. And we'll speak to you again in a month, 6 weeks or so.
Cheers.